The town of Red Hollow did not appear on most maps. It crouched low in a valley 3 days' ride from the nearest respectable settlement, a rough spill of buildings clinging to a dry riverbed like something ashamed of itself. The land surrounding it was scrub and dust and bone-colored rock. Wind scraped across it in long, lonely sighs that carried the taste of alkali and despair. Nothing grew willingly there. Even the sagebrush looked defeated. Jesse Callahan had not meant to stop. He had intended only to water his horse, perhaps take a meal, and continue east to inspect a line of cattle rumored to be strong-backed Texas stock worth breeding. Red Hollow was a detour, and Jesse did not believe in detours. Detours meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant loss. He had learned that lesson in the ground beneath his wife's grave marker 3 years ago, and he had not forgotten it since. But the prize bull he sought was stabled outside the only saloon in town, a broad-shouldered animal tethered in the heat, hide gleaming red-brown like polished mahogany, muscle thick along its haunches and rolling slabs of potential profit. The beast lowered its head and regarded Jesse with flat, unimpressed eyes. Jesse drew rein. He was 29, tall and lean in the saddle, dark hair clipped short against the heat, hat brim casting his face in shadow. The sun had browned him deep over years of outdoor work, but it had not softened him. Nothing had softened Jesse Callahan in years. His hands, resting easy on the reins, bore calluses earned honestly, and scars earned otherwise. His eyes, pale gray like winter sky, missed very little. He dismounted slowly, boots landing with controlled weight in the dust. His horse snorted behind him, restless, sensing his distraction. The bull watched him approach. Jesse ran a hand along its flank, feeling the solid heft of it, the warmth rising off the hide like banked coals. Worth the detour after all, perhaps. He'd make an offer before leaving. The saloon doors swung inward before he reached them. Noise spilled out first. Laughter, shouting, the crack of glass, the twang of a badly tuned piano being mauled by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. Then the smell. Whiskey, sweat, cigar smoke, unwashed bodies, something sour beneath it all that might have been despair, or might have been spilled beer. Hard to tell the difference in a place like this. Jesse stepped inside. The room was crowded. Hard men with unwashed collars and restless eyes. Travelers. Gamblers. Drifters. A few women painted too bright for daylight, their smiles fixed in place like decorations on a grave. The floor was sticky underfoot. The air was thick enough to chew. No one greeted him. They saw the cut of his coat, expensive but worn for utility. The silver watch chain at his waist, his father's before him. The steady way he moved, like a man who knew exactly where his next meal was coming from and had the means to protect it. They saw all of this, and they calculated. Jesse ignored them. He walked to the bar with the unhurried gait of a man who had nothing to prove and less to fear. The bartender, a fleshy individual with sweat beading on his forehead, placed a glass before him without being asked. Jesse ordered a whiskey. Tasted it. Inferior. Rot gut cut with something chemical. He set it aside untouched, the glass making a soft click against the wood. A man at the far table laughed too loudly, the sound grating as a dull saw. Jesse's gaze shifted without appearing to. Old habit. Know where the exits are. Know who's armed. Know who's drunk enough to be dangerous, and who's sober enough to mean it. And then he heard a name. Ain't worth that much, even pretty as she is. Shut up, Michael. The sound of that name hit him. Not sharp, not explosive. Cold, like stepping into shade on a burning day, except the shade went all the way through. Michael. He turned, slow. Near the staircase, leaning back in a chair with boots propped on a table, sat Michael Granger. Time had not been kind. The boy Jesse once knew. Reckless grin, fast horse, quicker temper, the kind of friend who'd ride with you into trouble and laugh on the way out, had hardened into something meaner. His jaw was leaner now, almost gaunt, eyes bloodshot and moving too fast, beard grown wild along his face in patches that suggested neglect rather than style. His coat was expensive once, but now stained at the cuffs, wrinkled across the shoulders. His hands restless on his knees, fingers drumming, twitching, never still. A gambler's hands. A drunkard's hands. A man running from something's hands. Jesse had not seen him in 10 years. 10 years since they'd been boys together on adjacent claims, since Michael had courted Abigail Turner behind her father's back, since Jesse had swallowed his own feelings like bitter medicine and watched her choose the wilder man. Michael caught sight of him and froze. For a moment, recognition flashed. Something passed across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of old friendship. Then it was gone, replaced by something uglier. A slow smile stretched across his mouth, showing teeth. Well, I'll be damned, Michael drawled, pushing to his feet with exaggerated ease. The chair scraped back. If it ain't the Callahan prince, come down from his castle to visit us common folk. The room quieting. Jesse did not respond to the bait. He walked closer, each step deliberate, boots sounding against the floorboards. Men shifted out of his path without seeming to notice they were doing it. "I hear you're in cattle now," Michael continued, spreading his hands wide as if inviting applause. "Big landowner. Big house, big everything. Hear you married well too. Real well, some banker's daughter with land connections." He tilted his head, mock curiosity on his face. "She's still living?" "I heard. She's dead," Jesse said flatly. Something flickered in Michael's eyes. Not guilt, exactly, but a dim recognition that he'd stepped past a line. "Ah!" He cleared his throat. "Well, my condolences." Jesse's gaze moved past him. To the staircase, there were men gathered at its base. Watching. Waiting. Hard-eyed men with the look of those who'd come to witness something, not merely drink. They stood in a loose semicircle, blocking access to the upper floor, and their attention was fixed upward with the hungry patience of wolves at a baited trap. "What's upstairs?" Jesse asked. Michael's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Business." A chair scraped somewhere behind Jesse. Footsteps approached. One of the men at the stairbase called out without turning. "Auction starts in 5. Last call for whiskey and bets." A ripple of interest moved through the room. Men straightened. Glasses were drained. Money changed hands quietly. Jesse's jaw tightened. "Auction of what?" Michael looked almost amused. "Of a debt." Jesse held his gaze. "Yours?" Michael's smile faltered just slightly. His eyes darted left, then right, checking who might be listening. "Mine," he said, and for a moment his voice lost its swagger, became something thinner. "But collateral don't belong to me no more once the hammer drops. That's the law here. Debt's debt. You sign, you pay, or you offer something worth paying." Something in Jesse's spine locked. A cold certainty was forming in his chest, taking shape like ice on a winter pond. "Collateral," he repeated. Michael leaned closer, breath thick with whiskey and something sour underneath. "You don't want in on this, Callahan. Ain't your kind of purchase. Ain't your kind of trouble. Ride on. Go look at your cattle. Forget you passed through." Jesse stepped back from him. "I'll decide that." He moved toward the stairs. Michael grabbed his arm. Fast. Hard enough to bruise. Jesse looked down at the hand gripping him. Then, back at Michael. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Just waited. Michael's hand fell away, as if burned. "Careful what you buy," he said softly, and there was something almost like fear in his voice now. "Some things got prices you can't afford." Jesse climbed the stairs. Upstairs was hotter. The air felt trapped, thick with anticipation and liquor fumes, body heat and desperation. The upper room had been cleared of its usual furniture, tables pushed against walls, chairs stacked in corners. A makeshift platform had been erected at one end, rough planks laid across barrels. Lanterns hung low from the ceiling beams, casting a yellow glow that swallowed shadows but did not remove them. They swung slightly in some draft Jesse couldn't feel, making the light shift and sway like something underwater. Men stood shoulder to shoulder. 24 at least. Maybe more. Their faces were upturned toward the platform, hungry and expectant, and in the lantern light they looked less like men than like something carved from tallow, soft, melting, waiting to be shaped by whoever held the heat. And at the center of the platform, Jesse stopped. For a moment, his mind refused the image. The woman seated in a straight-backed chair, wrists tied loosely in front of her with rope that had been used before, stained dark in places, head bowed, hair pale as summer wheat falling in tangled strands around her face, catching the lantern light like spun gold despite the dirt and the neglect. Her dress torn at the sleeve, bruised dark against her cheekbone, spreading purple and yellow at the edges, lip split, dried blood, black in the corner of her mouth. But unmistakable. Abigail Turner. She lifted her head. Their eyes met. The world narrowed. 10 years disappeared. She was 16 again, standing in a field behind her father's shack, sunlight in her hair like a blessing, laughing at him for being too serious, too careful, too weighed down by responsibilities he'd inherited but never asked for. "You frown like an old man, Jesse. Like you're carrying the whole world, and it's bending you in half." He had been 19 and already carrying responsibility like armor, already learning that wanting things was the first step toward losing them. "I've got a lot to carry." "Then put some of it down." She'd reached out, touched his cheek. "Just for a while. Just for me." He had loved her then, loved her before he knew what love cost. Now she was 26, and seated for sale. Her eyes did not widen at the sight of him. They did not soften. They sharpened. A flicker of something moved there. Recognition, yes. And something like warning. A tiny shake of her head, barely perceptible. "Go away. Don't be here. Don't see me like this." The man beside her cleared his throat. He was portly, sweating in a collar too tight, holding a paper in one hand and a small gavel in the other. An auctioneer by trade, probably, hired for occasions like this, regardless of what was being sold. Gentlemen, this is a lawful settlement of debt, witnessed and recorded according to the statutes of this territory. Michael Granger owes. Jesse's gaze shifted to Michael, who had followed him upstairs and now leaned against the wall near the staircase, arms crossed, expression carefully blank. Michael caught him looking and raised his hands in mock surrender. Gambled bad. Happens. He shrugged as if discussing the weather. She knew what I was when she married me. The auctioneer continued, unaware or uncaring of the undercurrents in the room. $500 plus accrued interest, total owed to Misters Hawkins and Webb of the Gold Star Gaming Hall, Red Hollow. A murmur ran through the room. 500 was no small sum. In this territory, 500 could buy a herd, a homestead, a year's worth of supplies, and then some. The collateral offered, the auctioneer said, gesturing to Abigail with a wave of his paper, is his lawful wife. The word struck harder than Jesse expected. Wife. He had heard rumors, of course. Drifters passing through his land had mentioned it sometimes. Not knowing the name meant anything to him. That she ran off with Michael. That she had married him somewhere beyond county lines, in a territory where questions weren't asked and records weren't kept. But rumors were smoke. This was fire. Abigail's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the bruise on her cheek. She stared at the floorboards as though memorizing their grain, as though if she looked hard enough at something real, the rest of this might dissolve. Bidding starts at 300. Silence. Men assessed her openly. Calculated. She was pretty still, even with the bruises, even with the split lip, fair hair, good bones, young enough to bear children. A wife could be useful. A wife could be sold again. A wife could be. A voice called out from near the window. 350. Another. 4. The bids came like stones dropping into still water. Each one rippled through the room, and with each one, Abigail's shoulders tightened further. Michael leaned casually against the wall, though his fingers twitched against his sleeves. He was watching the bids with an expression that mixed calculation with something else. Shame, perhaps, buried so deep it barely registered. Abigail did not beg. She did not cry. She stared at the floorboards. 450. Jesse did not remember deciding. His mouth opened. His voice came out. 600. The word cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. Michael's face went slack, mouth falling open. The auctioneer blinked rapidly, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. $600? Jesse removed his gloves slowly, deliberately, pulling each finger free with care. 600. United States currency. Payable now. A heavy pause. No one countered. The other bidders exchanged glances, weighing the sum against their resources, their interest, their willingness to cross a man who could toss $600 like pocket change. The auctioneer cleared his throat. 600, going once, twice. He looked around the room, waiting. Nothing. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded obscenely loud in the silence. Sold. The word hit the room like a physical force. Michael straightened. Now hold on. You named your debt, Jesse said evenly. I've covered it. The transaction is complete. Michael's expression darkened, twisting into something ugly. She ain't cattle. You can't just... No, Jesse replied. She's not. He stepped toward the platform. Men moved aside to let him pass. No one met his eyes. Abigail looked up at him as he approached. Up close, the bruises were worse than he'd thought from a distance. There were marks along her collarbone, visible through the torn fabric of her dress. Fingerprints, dark against her skin. The split on her lip was fresh enough to still seep slightly at the corner. The bruise on her cheekbone extended nearly to her eye, which was bloodshot at the corner. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He untied her wrists himself, working the knots with careful fingers, trying not to let his hands shake. The rope had left marks. Raw skin. He'd seen rope burns before, on cattle, on horses. He'd never imagined seeing them on her. She did not flinch at his touch. Stand, he said quietly. She did. Her legs trembled once, barely, as if her knees might give way. But she caught herself, straightened, lifted her chin despite everything. He did not touch her beyond what was necessary. Behind him, Michael laughed, sharp and ugly, the sound of a man who'd lost but needed everyone to think he didn't care. You think you saved her? He called out. You think she's grateful? She ain't the girl you remember, Callahan. She ain't anything you remember. 10 years is a long time to learn what a woman really is. Jesse did not turn. Neither are you. He guided Abigail toward the stairs, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching. She walked slowly, stiffly, as if every movement cost something. The crowd parted before them like water around a stone. Outside, the evening light was blinding after the dimness within. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the dust. The bull was still there, tethered where he'd left it. His horse waited patiently. Jesse lifted Abigail into the saddle, before mounting behind her. She was lighter than she should have been. He could feel her ribs through the fabric of her dress, the sharp angles of her hips. Too light. Much too light. She made no sound as he settled behind her. No protest, no thanks, no acknowledgement at all. They rode out without another word. Red Hollow shrank behind them, its buildings growing smaller against the vastness of the landscape, until they were nothing but smudges on the horizon, then nothing at all. For miles, neither spoke. The land rolled dry and empty around them, stretching to distant hills that caught the last of the light. Wind carried the scent of sage and dust, clean after the closeness of that upstairs room. A hawk circled somewhere overhead, patient and alone. Finally, she said, without turning, "You shouldn't have done that." Her voice was hoarse but steady, raw, as if she hadn't used it much lately, or had used it screaming. "I know," he replied. "Why did you?" He considered the question. There were many answers he could give. "Because I loved you once. Because no one deserves that. Because I couldn't not." Instead, he said, "Because I could." A short, humorless breath left her, not quite a laugh. "That's always been your answer. If you can do a thing, you do it. No thought to whether you should." "I thought about it. Not long enough." Silence stretched again. He felt the tension in her body, the pride fighting against exhaustion, the anger simmering beneath the surface. She held herself rigid in the saddle, refusing to lean back against him, refusing any comfort his presence might offer. "You planning to take me back to the nearest town?" she asked. "No." Her shoulders stiffened. "Then where?" "My ranch." That earned a reaction. She twisted slightly, enough to look back at him, and in the fading light he could see the flash of something dangerous in her eyes. "You don't own me, Jesse. I purchased a debt." "I'm not a debt." "I know. Do you?" She held his gaze for a long moment, searching. Then she turned forward again. "Do you really?" They rode through sunset. The sky bled orange and red across the horizon, staining the world in firelight that turned the dust to gold, and the distant hills to purple shadow. The temperature dropped as the light failed, the desert's rapid shift from heat to cold. At last he said, "You can work off what I paid." Her laugh was low and bitter, carrying no humor at all. "As what? A mistress? A servant? A warm body in your bed to replace the one you lost?" He flinched. She couldn't see it, but she must have felt it in the slight tightening of his arms around her. "No," he said carefully. "Whatever you choose. Cook. Clean. Help with the books. I have a housekeeper already, but she's getting older. Could use assistance. Those are not choices." "No," he agreed. "They're options. There's a difference." She turned forward again. "You haven't changed," she murmured, so quietly he barely caught it. He did not answer. But he had changed. He had buried a wife 3 years ago, watched the coffin lowered into ground that had been frozen solid, had to be broken with picks and shovels and cursing men. He had stood at that grave alone afterward, the preacher gone, the mourners gone, nothing left but wind and raw earth and the terrible weight of silence. He had built a cattle empire out of stubbornness and grief, pouring himself into work, because work was the only thing that didn't remind him of what he'd lost. He had learned that power did not fill a house at night. That money did not warm an empty bed. That success, measured in acres and head count and bank balances, was a poor substitute for the things that actually mattered. But he had also learned that you couldn't go back. Couldn't undo. Couldn't reclaim. They rode until dark. When they stopped to rest the horses, he built a small fire in the lee of a rock outcropping. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows against the stone. She sat apart from him, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching the fire with empty eyes. He removed his coat and held it out. She hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she said, so quietly it nearly disappeared into the wind. It was the first gratitude she had offered. He sat across from her, the fire between them, and watched the flames play across her face. In this light, with the shadows softening the bruises, she looked almost like the girl he remembered. Almost. "Does he still hit you?" he asked. She did not look up. "He did more than that." The words were flat, matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather or the condition of the road. Jesse's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists again. He made them relax by force of will. "You could have come home," he said. "Home?" She lifted her eyes then, fierce despite exhaustion, despite everything. "To what? Your father's land? Your rules? Your future mapped out like a fence line? Every post in its place? Every boundary marked and measured?" You would have been safe. I didn't want safe. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. I wanted. She stopped. Shook her head. It doesn't matter what I wanted. And now? She held his gaze. Now I want something else. What? Not pity. He looked at her for a long time. The fire popped and crackled between them. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. I never pitied you, he said. She searched his face as if testing the truth of that, looking for the lie beneath the words. Whatever she found there made something shift in her expression, not softening exactly, but a relaxation of the tight control she'd been maintaining. You always looked at me like I was something fragile, she said. Something that needed protecting. Something that would break if you weren't careful. I looked at you like you mattered. That's not the same thing. He had no answer. The wind shifted, carrying smoke toward her. She coughed once, then waved it away. Tell me about your wife, she said. The question caught him off guard. What? Your wife, the one who died. Tell me about her. Why? She shrugged inside his coat. Because I'm sitting here with you instead of in that room. Because you paid $600 for me. Because I want to know what kind of man does that. She paused. Because if I think about anything else right now, I'll start screaming and I don't know if I'd be able to stop. He understood that. Understood it better than she could know. Her name was Margaret, he said slowly. She was a banker's daughter. Her father owned land adjacent to mine. The marriage was arranged. Beneficial to both families. Did you love her? The question hung in the air between them. I respected her, he said. I cared for her. We built something together. But love? He stared into the fire. I don't know if I knew what that meant by then. I'd already learned that loving someone doesn't keep them safe. Doesn't keep them with you. Abigail was quiet for a moment. She was lucky, she said finally. To have that much, at least. She died of fever. 3 years ago last spring. It took her in 4 days. There was nothing anyone could do. I'm sorry. It was a simple thing to say. People said it all the time, meaning nothing by it. But the way she said it, quiet, genuine, without any attempt to soften or comfort, made something shift in his chest. She would have liked you, he said. Margaret. She was practical. Strong. She'd have understood. Understood what? Why I did what I did today. Abigail looked at him across the fire. Would she? I think so. They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned lower. He added more wood. Michael wasn't always like that, she said quietly. When we first ran off together, he was exciting. Reckless. He made me feel alive in a way I'd never felt before. Like every day might be an adventure. Like the rules didn't apply to us, but they did. Eventually, she pulled the coat tighter around herself. The gambling started small. Then it wasn't small. Then the drinking. Then the other women. Then the... She touched her cheek, where the bruise darkened her skin. That came later, after he'd lost everything else and needed someone to blame. Why did you stay? Where would I go? Her voice cracked again, more noticeably this time. Back to my father's shack? Back to your father's judgment? Back to everyone who said I'd made my choice, and now I had to live with it? She shook her head. I had nowhere. No money. No family that would take me. No skills that would earn a living. I stayed because staying was easier than admitting I'd been wrong about everything. That's not easier. No, she agreed. It's not. He wanted to reach across the fire and touch her. Wanted to offer some comfort, some reassurance, but he didn't know if she'd welcome it, didn't know if he had the right. I'm sorry, he said instead. For whatever that's worth. I'm sorry you went through that. I'm sorry I wasn't there. You couldn't have been. I could have tried harder to find you, after you left. I looked for a while, but then my father got sick, and the ranch needed Jesse. Her voice stopped him. Stop. You don't owe me an accounting. You never did. He fell silent. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, a long, lonely sound that rose and fell, and was answered by another in the distance. They slept in silence, each on opposite sides of the fire, the night stretching vast and cold around them. At dawn, they rode again. The sun rose red behind them, painting the world in shades of gold, and rose as they headed east toward his land. She rode before him in the saddle, still holding herself apart, still refusing to lean back against him. But as the miles stretched between them and Red Hollow, something unspoken followed. Not ownership, not rescue, but unfinished history, and a reckoning yet to come. Chapter 2. The Big House. They reached Callahan land at dusk on the second day. The change in the landscape came gradual at first. Then, all at once, the scrub thinned. The earth shifted from bone-white dust to deeper brown loam, rich and dark as coffee grounds. Fences appeared along the horizon, straight, deliberate lines cut across the wild like declarations carved into the land itself. Not the crooked, patched-together barriers of subsistence ranchers, but proper fencing, well-maintained, each post set true. Windmills turned slow and steady in the distance, their blades catching the last light, pumping water into troughs that cattle surrounded in patient clusters. Cattle dotted the rolling pastureland, dark shapes against gold grass, their coats gleaming with health. Abigail felt it before she saw it fully. Order. Jesse's world was ordered. Fields rotated cleanly, fallow sections alternating with grazing land in patterns that spoke of planning and foresight. Water troughs sat evenly spaced, accessible without crowding. The fences were repaired, not sagging, tight and true as a surveyor's line. Even the ranch hands they passed rode with quiet purpose rather than restless drift, their horses well-fed and responsive, their nods toward Jesse carrying respect rather than familiarity. "You've grown the place," she said finally, her voice rough from disuse and dust. "Yes. How many acres?" "Close to 8,000 now." He said it without pride, as if stating the time of day. She let out a slow breath. "You did well. I worked." The place had doubled from what his father left him years ago. She remembered the old Callahan spread from childhood visits. Respectable, but not remarkable. This was something else entirely. This was empire building, one fence post and water rights negotiation at a time. They crested a rise, and the house came into view. It stood on a gentle hill overlooking the lower pasture, a large two-story structure of pale wood and dark shutters, wide porch wrapping around the front like open arms that did not quite embrace. A barn sat to the left, red-painted and expansive, its roof lying clean against the darkening sky. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray, promising warmth within. Lamplight glowed from a few windows, golden and inviting. It was not ostentatious. It was solid. Built to last. Built to withstand. Built like the man who owned it. Abigail's throat tightened unexpectedly. She had imagined his success before, had pictured it in moments when Michael was drunk and raging, and she lay awake staring at cracked ceilings, wondering how her life had become this. She had imagined Jesse in a fine house, with a fine wife, with children perhaps, living the life she might have had if she'd made different choices. But imagination had not prepared her for the reality of it. This was stability made visible. This was permanence carved from sweat and determination. This was what she had turned away from at 16. The horse shifted beneath them, and she realized she'd been sitting motionless, staring. As the horse moved, she felt the hard line of Jesse's chest against her back, a solid heat that seemed to seep through her thin layers and anchor her to the saddle. "Abigail?" She blinked. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. As they rode into the yard, two ranch hands approached, both broad-shouldered men in their 30s, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their eyes sharp with the particular alertness of men who worked livestock and knew to assess everything that moved. "Evenin', Mr. Callahan," one said, tipping his hat. He was the taller of the two, with sandy hair and a calm, deliberate way of moving. Jesse nodded. "Evening, Tom." Eli. Their eyes shifted to Abigail. Assessed. Questioned. Took in the borrowed coat, the visible bruise on her cheek, the way she sat forward in the saddle, rather than leaning back against Jesse. Jesse did not hesitate. "This is Abigail Turner," he said evenly. "She'll be staying here." No explanation, no apology, just fact. The men exchanged a glance but said nothing. Ranch etiquette, apparently, did not include questioning the boss about strange women delivered at dusk. "Get the horses watered," Jesse added, "and have Mrs. Klein bring some broth up to the spare room." Abigail stiffened slightly at the phrasing. "Staying here. Spare room." She slid from the saddle before Jesse could assist her, but her muscles, cramped from the long ride and the underlying fear of the last few days, failed her. Her legs buckled. The ground rushed up, then stopped, Jesse's hands catching her, hauling her upright, steadying her against the broad, unyielding planes of his chest. She went rigid in his arms. "I can stand," she said tightly. "I know." But he didn't release her immediately. For one suspended second they stood too close, his hands firm and heavy at her waist, his thumbs pressing instinctively into the curve of her hip. Her breath hitched, uneven against his chest, and she was acutely aware of the rhythmic thud of his heart. She could smell him. Leather and horses and clean sweat, wood smoke from the fire he'd built last night, and a deeper, more primal scent that was simply him. 10 years since she'd been this close to him, and her body hummed with a sudden, treacherous memory of a younger Jesse Callahan, one who hadn't yet learned to be made of stone. Then she stepped back, the loss of his heat feeling like a physical blow. His hands fell away, his fingers curling as if to retain the sensation of her. Neither spoke. Mrs. Klein emerged from the house as if summoned, a thin woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled tight into a bun so severe it looked painful. Her dress was dark and practical, her apron spotless, her shoes sensible. Her sharp eyes took in Abigail's torn dress and bruised face in a single sweep, missing nothing. No shock, no pity, just assessment. "Upstairs," she said briskly. "Bathwater's already heating." Abigail blinked. "For me?" Mrs. Klein sniffed. "You smell like that town." "No offense intended, but you do. Can't have you tracking whatever's in that place through a clean house." She turned without waiting for a response and marched back toward the door. Abigail almost smiled. She hadn't smiled in longer than she could remember. Inside, the house was cool and dim. Polished floors gleamed in the lamplight. Dark wood that had been cared for, waxed, maintained. Framed photographs lined the walls, stern-faced ancestors, cattle, landscapes. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the entryway, its pendulum swinging with hypnotic regularity. Abigail's boots left faint dust prints behind her on the otherwise immaculate floor. She noticed everything. The heavy oak table in the dining room, long enough to seat a dozen but currently empty. The books stacked neatly in a corner study. Ledgers, agricultural journals, a few novels. The absence of clutter? The quiet. It felt lonely. Not empty, exactly, but inhabited by someone who lived alone, who had grown accustomed to silence, who no longer expected voices to fill the space. Mrs. Klein led her upstairs to a bedroom at the end of the hall. White curtains at the window, stirring slightly in the evening breeze. A large bed with a quilt in shades of blue, neatly made. A washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a clean towel folded beside it. A small writing desk beneath the window. It was not the master room, that was obvious even without seeing it, from its position at the end of the hall rather than the front, from its slightly smaller size, from the absence of personal touches. But it was comfortable. Clean, safe. The word lodged in her chest like a splinter. "You'll bathe," Mrs. Klein said, moving efficiently around her, drawing water from a covered pail into the tub that had been placed before the small fireplace, setting out folded linens, a cake of soap that smelled of roses. "Then you'll eat, then you'll sleep. Questions can wait until morning." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "Door locks from the inside," she added. "In case you're wondering." Then she was gone. When they were alone, Abigail stood still in the center of the room, listening to the silence. The clock ticked downstairs. A horse stamped in the yard. Somewhere, a door closed softly. She stared at herself in the mirror above the washstand. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The bruises, purple and yellow now, spreading across her cheekbone, darkening the corner of her eye. The hollowness in her cheeks, cheekbones too prominent, shadows beneath them. The dullness behind her eyes, the thing that happened when you stopped hoping, because hoping hurt too much. "You're not broken," she whispered to her reflection. The words felt thin, unconvincing. The bathwater steamed, fragrant with rose. She undressed slowly. Every bruise had a memory. The fingerprints on her arms, 3 weeks ago, when he'd grabbed her for talking back. The mottled purple along her ribs. A fall, he'd called it. But she'd tripped because he'd shoved her. The marks on her wrists from the rope. Yesterday, waiting for the auction, tied like an animal. She catalogued them like a map of survival. Each one meant she was still alive. She sank into the water and nearly sobbed from the shock of heat against abused skin. The warmth seeped into muscles that had been clenched for days, for weeks, for years. The rose smell filled her nostrils, clean and sweet, and suddenly she was crying. Not the noisy sobs she'd choked back through every beating, every humiliation, but silent tears that slid down her cheeks and dropped into the bathwater without a sound. She cried for the girl she'd been at 16, who'd thought running off with Michael Granger was an adventure. She cried for the woman she'd become at 26, who'd learned that adventures had prices. She cried because she was clean and warm and safe, and she hadn't known until this moment how much she'd missed all three. Downstairs, Jesse stood at the dining table with both palms braced against the wood, head bowed. The phantom sensation of her waist beneath his hands wouldn't leave him. The memory of her softness, even beneath the bruises and the dirt, made his blood feel thick and heavy. Tom lingered near the door, hat in hands, waiting. "She trouble?" Tom asked carefully. Jesse didn't look up. "No. Granger's wife, ain't she? Heard tell he married someone from these parts a while back. Never thought I'd see Abigail Turner again, though. Figured she'd gone for good." He paused. "Is she stayin'?" "Yes." Tom nodded slowly, processing. "Town'll talk. They already do." "You plan on marrying her?" Jesse's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ached. He lifted his head, met Tom's gaze. "I plan on nothing." Tom studied him a moment longer, reading something in his employer's face that Jesse himself probably couldn't see. Then he tipped his hat and left, the door closing softly behind him. Jesse remained. He had not thought beyond the moment of that gavel falling. He had seen her on that platform, tied like livestock, bruised and broken, and still holding herself with a pride that made his chest ache. And he had acted. No calculation. No weighing of consequences. Just the absolute undeniable certainty that he could not leave her there. Now consequence waited upstairs. Later, when Abigail descended, clean and dressed in one of Mrs. Klein's spare gowns, a simple thing in pale gray that fit her well enough, though it was clearly not her own, the house stilled. Her hair, washed and brushed, fell pale and loose around her shoulders, catching the lamplight like winter wheat. The bruises remained, stark against her skin, but softened somehow against the clean background. Her face, scrubbed free of travel grime, showed the bones beneath. Good bones, strong bones. The face of a woman who'd been pretty once and might be again. She looked younger. And older. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs when she saw him waiting. They regarded one another in the quiet. Jesse felt the air leave his lungs. He had seen her in ball gowns and in sun-drenched fields, but seeing her here, in the quiet gravity of his own home, was a different kind of haunting. "You look," he began, then stopped, his eyes lingering on the curve of her throat, the way the gray fabric clung to the delicate line of her shoulders. "Different?" she supplied, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "Yes, so do you." Her voice was steadier now, some of the hoarseness gone. She let her gaze travel over him, noting the breadth of his shoulders and the way his shirt pulled tight across his chest. "Older. Heavier, thanks." She almost smiled. "Almost. I didn't mean badly. Just heavier. Like you're carrying more than you used to." He gestured toward the table, his voice sounding lower, huskier than intended. "Sit." They ate broth and bread in silence at first. She held the spoon steadily, despite the tremor still running faint through her hands. The broth was good, rich and hot, flavored with herbs she couldn't name. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful hit her stomach. After several minutes, she set the spoon down. "You said I could work off what you paid." "Yes, I want terms." His brows lifted slightly. "Terms? I won't be your mistress." Her voice was calm, controlled. She'd practiced this speech in her head while bathing, while dressing, while descending the stairs. "And I won't share your bed as repayment for this rescue. If that's what you expect, you should tell me now, and I'll find another way." "I didn't ask you to." "You implied." "No." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gray eyes steady on hers, dark with an intensity she couldn't quite name. "You assumed." She studied him. The years had carved lines into his face that weren't there before, brackets around his mouth, creases at the corners of his eyes. Grief lines, she thought, the kind that came from losing something irreplaceable. His wife. His future. His expectations of how life would go. "You want me as a servant," she said. "I want you safe." "That's not what I asked." He leaned back in his chair, considering her, his eyes tracing the line of her split lip with a hunger that made her skin prickle. "I have a housekeeper. Mrs. Klein runs this place like a general runs an army. She doesn't need help. And she wouldn't want it if she did. Then why bring me here? Because I couldn't leave you there. Because I can still taste the memory of you from 10 years ago." He did not say it. "You needed a solution," he said instead. "This is one." She folded her hands on the table. "I won't scrub floors forever. I don't expect you to." "Then what do you expect?" He hesitated. The truth sat uncomfortably between them. A third presence at the table, thick and heavy as the humidity before a storm. "I don't know yet." That at least was honest. She leaned back slowly, matching his posture, watching him with eyes that had learned to read men, their tells, their weaknesses, the spaces between their words. "In my travels," she said after a moment, "I learned a few things. About trade routes, rail schedules, market prices." Her eyes sharpened slightly, the dullness he'd seen earlier, retreating behind something more calculating. Michael gambled more than cards. He gambled cattle futures, land deeds, supply shipments. He wasn't good at it. He wasn't good at anything except losing. But he talked. Endlessly. And I listened. Jesse watched her closely now, something shifting in his expression. "I learned which buyers pay premium for breeding stock rather than slaughter weight. I learned which rail lines offer better rates during which seasons. I learned that Eastern markets pay more for grass-fed beef than grain-fed, despite what the local traders claim." She paused, letting that settle. "I learned that most ranchers oversaturate their land because they rotate poorly. They run too many head on too little grass, then wonder why their herds lose condition by late summer. The Sioux rotate their grazing naturally, following the grass, moving constantly. But white ranchers think they know better and end up with eroded pasture and thin cattle." His expression shifted, just slightly. "And I learned," she continued evenly, "that rail contracts negotiated directly with Eastern distributors fetch nearly 20% higher margins than middleman auctions. Michael lost a fortune once because he didn't understand that. The man who beat him on that deal did understand, and he's probably retired by now on the profits." The room grew very quiet. The clock ticked in the entryway, "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that you can improve my operation." "I'm suggesting," she corrected, "that I am more valuable than a maid." A long pause. Then, "Prove it." Her pulse jumped. He rose from the table and crossed to a cabinet in the corner, withdrawing a thick ledger book bound in leather, its pages stuffed with papers and marked with slips. He set it before her with a solid thump. "These are my current contracts," he said. "Buyers. Volumes. Timelines. Prices. Rail agreements. Grazing rotations. The whole operation, as of this month." She stared at the book. 10 years ago, he would never have placed something like this before her. 10 years ago, she would never have asked. They had been different people then, living in a different world. "You trust me with this?" she asked quietly. "I trust you to be who you've always been." He sat back down, leaning into her space until she could feel the radiating warmth of his body. "Stubborn. Clever. Determined to prove yourself. If there's something in there worth finding, you'll find it. And if I find something you don't want found, then we'll deal with that when it happens." She reached out and touched the ledger, her fingers tracing its worn cover. 2 weeks, she said. "For what?" "To show you I'm right. To find something in here that improves your margins, your efficiency, your understanding of your own operation. Something you didn't see before. And if you're not," she met his eyes, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "Then I scrub floors." A slow, assessing silence. Then he nodded once. 2 weeks. The agreement hung between them, fragile and charged with something electric that neither of them dared to name. Later that night, she stood at the bedroom window, looking out over the moonlit pasture. The land rolled away from the house in waves of silver and shadow, the grass moving in the wind like water. Cattle stood in dark clusters here and there, some lying down, some standing patient and still. The windmill turned slowly, its blades catching moonlight. This land was powerful, so was the man who controlled it. But she had not survived Michael Granger to become someone else's possession. She had not endured years of brutality to trade one cage for another, however gilded. If Jesse thought she would be grateful and obedient, he would learn otherwise. If he thought she would fade into the background, a silent recipient of his charity, he would be disappointed. She had spent 10 years watching, listening, learning. 10 years surviving in a world that gave women no quarter and no mercy. 10 years becoming someone her 16-year-old self wouldn't recognize. It was time to find out what that someone was worth. Down the hall, Jesse stood outside his own door, staring at the wood grain without seeing it. She was here, under his roof, breathing the same night air. 10 years of distance undone in a single violent evening. He had told himself it was about decency, about justice, about doing what was right, because doing what was right was the only thing that kept a man from becoming the kind of person who could leave a woman tied to a chair while men bid on her. But beneath that, he wanted her, not as payment, not as property, not as a warm body to fill the empty space in his bed, as something far more dangerous, equal. He remembered the way she'd looked at him over the table tonight, fire in her eyes despite everything she'd been through, the way she'd laid out her terms like a business negotiation, refusing to be indebted, refusing to be owned, the way she'd touched that ledger like it was a promise. She was not the girl who'd left. Neither was he the boy who'd watched her go. He exhaled slowly. 2 weeks, he had said. 2 weeks to test her mind. 2 weeks to test himself. Because already he knew, the cold, transactional barrier he had intended to build was thinner than he liked. And when Abigail Turner decided she wanted something, she had always found a way to take it. The house settled into silence, but sleep did not come easily to either of them, not with unfinished history, breathing just beyond their doors. In her room, Abigail lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The bed was too soft, the sheets too clean, the quiet too complete. She was used to noise, Michael's drunken snoring, the creak of floorboards in cheap rooms, the sounds of other people living their lives thin walls away. This silence felt like a held breath. She thought about the ledger waiting downstairs, about the challenge Jesse had given her, about the 2 weeks stretching before her like a road she couldn't see the end of. She thought about his hands at her waist when she'd stumbled, the way he'd held on just a moment too long, the heat of his palms burning through her skin even now. She thought about the loneliness in this house, so carefully hidden beneath order and efficiency. And beneath the fear and the anger and the bone-deep exhaustion, something else stirred, something that felt almost like hope. She pushed it away. Hope was dangerous. Hope was what had made her believe Michael would change. Hope was what had kept her in places she should have fled. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But it lingered anyway, stubborn as the woman who felt it. In his room, Jesse sat on the edge of his bed, boots still on, staring at nothing. The room was large but sparsely furnished. Bed, dresser, washstand, a trunk at the foot of the bed. Margaret's touch had softened it once, with curtains she'd chosen, and a quilt her mother had made, and small decorations she'd collected. After she died, he'd removed most of it. Not out of anger, but because seeing her things hurt in ways he couldn't explain. Now the room felt like a hotel, like a place he slept but didn't live. He thought about Abigail in the spare room. About the bruises on her face. About the way she'd flinched when he caught her, just slightly, before she controlled it. About the fire in her eyes when she'd talked about contracts and markets and rail schedules. She had survived. Not just physically, though that was miracle enough. She had survived with her mind intact, her will unbroken, her capacity for fight still burning. He didn't know if he could say the same about himself. He pulled off his boots, set them by the bed. Tomorrow, there would be work. Cattle to check. Fences to ride. Decisions to make. Tomorrow, there would be her. He lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. 2 weeks. It felt like both no time at all and forever. Downstairs, the grandfather clock ticked on. The house held its breath around them. And somewhere in the darkness between their rooms, the past waited, patient as a coyote, hungry as fire, for its chance to become something else entirely. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Proposal. Morning on the Callahan ranch began before the sun. Abigail discovered this on her third day under Jesse's roof. The house was still dim when she came downstairs, the sky outside just beginning to pale into soft gray, that hushed moment between night and day when the world felt provisional, unfinished. The air smelled of coffee and wood smoke, rich and welcoming. Mrs. Klein stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, moving with military precision as she stirred something in a cast-iron pot. "You're up early," the older woman observed without turning. "So is everyone else. Cattle don't wait on comfort." A pause. "Neither does Mr. Callahan." Abigail poured herself coffee from the enamel pot and stepped out onto the porch. The land looked different at dawn, less imposing, more intimate. A thin mist lay over the lower pasture, like a breath held close to the earth, the cattle moving through it, like dark ships through fog. Riders were already out, small figures against the vastness. She recognized Jesse instantly, even at a distance. He rode as if born to it. Straight-backed. Economical. No wasted motion. His horse responded to shifts of weight, too subtle to see, moving with him like an extension of his will. Her chest tightened in a way she did not permit herself to examine. She had spent the last 2 days buried in his ledgers. Numbers upon numbers, purchase orders, rail contracts, seasonal yields, expenses for feed in drought months, veterinary losses, branding tallies. The pages were filled with his precise handwriting, every entry neat, every calculation double-checked. It was an impressive operation. It was also flawed. By the time Jesse returned mid-morning, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt and plastering dark hair to his forehead, she was waiting at the dining table. The ledger lay open before her, marked with slips of paper at half a dozen places. She'd been sitting there for an hour, going over her findings again and again, ensuring she hadn't missed a single detail. He removed his gloves slowly, pulling each finger free with deliberate care. His eyes moved over her, taking in the concentration on her face, the way she'd tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slight tension in her shoulders. "Well?" he asked. She stood. "You're overgrazing the north pasture." His brows lowered slightly, a crease forming between them. "No, I'm not. You are." She flipped the ledger around and pointed to the relevant entries. "You're running 600 head across land that should carry 450 at most during late summer. The grass hasn't had proper recovery time in 3 seasons. Look at these yield numbers. They've dropped each year, and your winter feed costs have risen to compensate." He stepped closer, leaning over the table to examine the pages. She could feel the heat from his body, smell sun and leather and clean male sweat, the faint tang of horse beneath it. His arm brushed hers as he reached to turn a page, and the contact sent a shiver through her that she hoped he didn't notice. "You're basing that on numbers," he said, his voice thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I'm basing that on grass height recorded in June and herd weight decline by September." She met his eyes, refusing to look away despite their proximity. "Your cattle lose condition before sale. The slaughter weights are consistent, but the rate of gain slows in late summer. That's a grazing issue, not a genetics issue." A quiet beat. "Go on," she swallowed, suddenly aware of how close he was, of the way his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You need rotational grazing." She gestured at the map she'd sketched in the margin. "Divide the north pasture into 4 segments. Move the herd every 3 weeks. Let the other sections recover fully before the cattle return. It'll increase grass yield, improve soil retention, and boost weight gain before market." He straightened slowly, but didn't step back. They were still close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the way his pupils dilated slightly as he looked at her. "You're suggesting more fencing." "I'm suggesting long-term profit instead of short-term convenience." His mouth twitched despite himself. Not quite a smile, but close. And what else? She slid another paper forward, careful not to let her fingers brush his. You're selling too much bulk beef. That's the backbone of the business. It's steady, she agreed. But not where the real money is. She tapped the page. Your breeding stock is superior. Look at these records. Strong lines, good bone structure, excellent muscle conformation, high fertility rates. You should be marketing premium bulls to smaller ranchers expanding west, not just shipping them east for slaughter weight prices. He watched her now with full attention, something shifting in his expression. She'd seen that look before, years ago. The way he focused on her when she said something that surprised him, that made him see her differently. And how would you propose finding these smaller ranchers? Rail manifests, she said simply. New homestead filings. There are families settling land every month through the Homestead Acts. They'll need breeding stock to establish their herds. If you establish contracts directly with them now, you set the price and build loyalty for years to come. He folded his arms across his chest, and the movement drew her eyes to the breadth of his shoulders, the way his shirt stretched across them. You sound very certain. I am. And the rail contracts you mentioned yesterday? The direct negotiations? You're selling through intermediaries in Abilene. She lifted her chin slightly. Negotiate directly with Kansas City buyers. Cut out the middlemen entirely. The rail lines are competing for freight now. You can leverage that. That's not easily done. No, she agreed. It isn't. It would take travel, meetings, probably some rejections before you found the right buyer. But the margin difference would pay for the effort within 2 seasons. Silence stretched between them. Wind moved faintly through the open window, carrying the scent of grass and distant rain. A bird called somewhere outside. You're asking for a seat at my table, he said at last. I'm asking for partnership in business, she corrected evenly. Not marriage, not charity, not obligation. Business. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. He studied her long and hard, his gaze moving over her face as if reading something written there. She forced herself to remain still under that examination, to let him look without flinching. You forget something, Abigail. What? You have no standing here. Her spine went rigid, but she didn't look away. I have knowledge. You have no capital, no land, no name attached to this operation, no legal standing to sign contracts or make decisions. Her jaw tightened. So give me something to prove I'm worth attaching one. The challenge in her eyes stirred something dark and electric inside him. She saw it flicker across his face, that spark of recognition, of wanting, of something deeper that made her breath catch. He walked around the table slowly until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. You want power, he said quietly. I want agency. You'll get neither for free. I'm not asking for free. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering. I'm asking for a chance to earn them. A long silence. Then he said, fine. She blinked. Fine, she echoed cautiously. I have a supplier coming tomorrow. A man named Horace Talbot. He supplies winter feed. Hay, primarily, plus some grain. He's difficult. Drives his prices up every season. Knows I have limited alternatives. I usually handle him myself. His eyes sharpened. You'll negotiate. Her pulse skipped. If you win favorable terms, he continued, we discuss further. Real terms, real partnership. And if I don't, then you go back to being my guest. Or my servant. Your choice. Her chin lifted. I accept. Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps. Or something warmer. Good. He didn't move. Neither did she. For a long moment they stood there, close enough to kiss, close enough that she could see the slight roughness of his jaw where he'd shaved that morning, the way his pulse beat visibly at his throat. Then he stepped back. Dinner's at 6, he said, and walked out. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Horace Talbot arrived the next afternoon in a cloud of dust and arrogance. He was thick-bodied, red-faced from sun and whiskey, with a mustache that twitched when he spoke like a nervous animal. His handshake was crushing, meant to intimidate, his smile oily with false friendliness. Callahan, he boomed, swinging down from his wagon. Heard you're expanding again. Must be doing something right. Jesse inclined his head from the porch. We're steady. Talbot's gaze shifted and landed on Abigail, who stood at the edge of the porch in a plain blue dress, hair neatly braided back from her face. His eyes traveled over her with the automatic assessment of a man who saw women as commodities. And who's this? New housekeeper? You're looking well-fed, Callahan. Maybe I should hire prettier help. Jesse's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Miss Turner. She handles negotiations now. Talbot barked a laugh. She does she? Abigail stepped forward before Jesse could respond. Yes, I do. Her voice was calm, level. She held Talbot's gaze without flinching. Talbot smirked, his mustache twitching. Well now. This'll be a novelty. Inside, they sat at the dining table. Talbot spread his papers across the polished wood, taking his time, trying to establish dominance through delay and show. Jessie sat slightly apart, watching, saying nothing. Talbot laid out his prices for winter feed supply, higher than last year by nearly 15%. He leaned back, clearly expecting argument, prepared for it. Abigail did not flinch. She examined his figures in silence for a long moment, then looked up. You're overcharging, she said simply. Talbot's mustache twitched. Market's tight. Drought in the Eastern Territories, rail problems out of St. Louis. Everyone's paying more this year. No, she replied. Rail costs dropped this quarter. I checked the published rates. The drought you mentioned affected corn, not hay. And you're not buying from those territories anyway. You're padding your prices based on rumors, not reality. Talbot glanced at Jessie, looking for reaction. Jessie said nothing. Abigail continued. We can source from Wichita at lower rates. I've seen their listings. The quality's comparable, and they're desperate for long-term contracts after losing their military supply bid. Wichita's unreliable. Their transport's a mess, not according to their last 3 shipment records. All arrived on time, all met quality standards. I checked with the rail depot in Abilene. Talbot shifted in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. You think you can do better? He challenged. Yes. How? She leaned forward slightly, and the movement drew his eyes despite himself. She was wearing a dress that buttoned to the throat, but the way she leaned in, the way her voice dropped just slightly, it was a negotiation tactic, and she knew it. You've lost 2 major contracts in the last year. The Army Depot in Fort Collins switched suppliers. The Larson brothers stopped buying from you after that bad shipment last spring. She held his eyes steadily. I know because I saw the public filings. You need this account more than we do. Talbot's face reddened further. Lower your rate by 10%, she continued smoothly. Lock in a 2-year supply agreement with fixed transport fees, and we guarantee volume. You get stability. We get fair pricing. Everyone wins. Talbot stared at her. Silence stretched. Jessie watched her hands, steady, folded neatly on the table. No tremor, no fear. She was utterly composed, utterly in control, and something in his chest tightened at the sight. Talbot huffed. 8%. 10. 9. 10, she repeated calmly. And the fixed transport fees? Non-negotiable. The man's jaw worked. He looked at Jessie, then back at her, then at Jessie again. You let a woman negotiate for you? He asked, trying a different tack. Jessie's eyes were cold. I let the best person for the job handle it. She's clearly better than I am. Abigail's heart stuttered at the words, but she kept her expression neutral. Finally, Talbot slapped the table. Fine. 10%. 2 years. Fixed transport. He shoved the papers toward her. Draw it up. Abigail did not smile. I'll have it ready for signature in an hour. When Talbot left, muttering but bound by his word, Jessie closed the door slowly. He turned to face her. You were ruthless, he said. She stood in the center of the room, still vibrating with the aftermath of the negotiation. You trained me well. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I did no such thing. No, she agreed softly. You didn't. But you taught me something anyway. You taught me that competence matters. That knowing your facts matters. That if you want something, you have to be willing to fight for it. He crossed the room toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name. You were magnificent, he said quietly. The word hung between them. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen since she arrived. Not fear, not calculation, not defense. Just her. Just Abigail, looking at him the way she used to, before everything. I missed this, she whispered. Feeling like I mattered. You matter, his voice was rough. You always did. He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away and touched her face. His fingers traced the curve of her cheek, the fading edge of the bruise, the line of her jaw. She closed her eyes for just a moment, leaning into the touch. When she opened them, something had shifted. Jessie, don't. His thumb traced her lower lip. Don't tell me we can't. Don't tell me it's too complicated. I've spent 10 years without you. I'm done. She pulled back slightly, but not far. This isn't simple. Nothing worthwhile is. I could destroy everything you've built. Maybe. He stepped closer again. Or maybe we could build something better together. Her breath came faster. You're offering partnership in more than business. I'm offering whatever you'll take. She reached up and touched his face in return, her fingers tracing the lines around his eyes, the evidence of years and grief and solitude. I'm not the girl you loved. No, he agreed. You're better. He kissed her. It was not soft. It was 10 years of restraint, snapping like wire under too much tension. His hands framed her face, pulled her close, and his mouth found hers with a hunger that surprised them both. Her back hit the dining table, papers scattered, her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, needing him closer. The taste of coffee and heat and anger and memory and want collided in something that was neither gentle nor careful. She kissed him back, hard, hungry, alive. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her against him, and she gasped at the contact. Not from fear, but from the shock of feeling wanted, truly wanted, after so long feeling like nothing. Abigail. He said her name against her mouth like a prayer. Yes. He lifted her onto the edge of the table, stepped between her legs, and for a moment they simply breathed each other in, foreheads pressed together, hearts pounding. This changes nothing, she said hoarsely. It changes everything. She pulled back just enough to look at him. Really look at him. I can't be your possession, Jesse. I can't be something you own. You're not. His hands tightened on her waist. You never were. Even when I wanted you to be, back then, you were never something I could own. You were always just you. And I loved you for it. Her eyes glistened. Say it again, she whispered. What? That you love me. He cupped her face in his hands. I love you. I never stopped. I tried. God knows I tried. But you were always there, in the back of my mind, in the spaces between things. The what if, the almost. A tear slid down her cheek. I made such terrible choices, she said. We all do. I hurt you. You did. He didn't deny it. And I hurt you by marrying someone else. By not coming after you. By letting pride and pain keep me from finding you. She covered his hands with hers. Can we start again? We already have. The clock ticked. The house held its breath. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped back. She slid off the table, straightening her dress, feeling the warmth of his touch still lingering on her skin. The contract, she said, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. I need to draw up Talbot's contract. Tomorrow. His voice was rough. It can wait until tomorrow. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the want in his eyes, the restraint, the effort it cost him to step back. Jesse. Yes? Thank you. For what? For seeing me. For not giving up. She touched his chest, right over his heart. For this. He caught her hand, pressed it flat against him. 2 weeks, he reminded her softly. You still have to prove yourself. A smile flickered across her face. Real this time. Warm. I will. That night, she lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. Her lips still tingled from his kiss. Her skin remembered the heat of his hands, the strength of his body against hers. She touched her mouth where he'd kissed her. Down the hall she knew he was awake too, waiting, wanting, the same way she was. The next morning, a folded paper lay at her place at the table. She picked it up slowly, hands trembling slightly. A written contract. Formal. Detailed. Legal. If the implemented strategies increase net revenue by 10% within 1 year, the party known as Abigail Turner shall receive a profit share equivalent to 5% ownership stake in all expansion profits derived from new ventures initiated during said period. Her hands trembled. He stood across the room, leaning against the doorframe, watching her read. This is business, he said evenly. If you earn it, it's yours. No strings. No obligations beyond the work. She read the last line twice. Then she looked up, and for the first time, since he had found her in that distant town, in that terrible room, she smiled. A real smile. Full and warm and alive. 5%, she said. To start. To start? He crossed the room slowly, stopping just before her. I meant what I said last night. I'm offering whatever you'll take. Partnership. In business. In life. In whatever we can build together. She looked at the contract, then at him. You trust me that much? I trust you, he said simply. I always did. The problem was never trusting you. It was trusting myself, not to want you too much. She set the paper down carefully. I want terms, she said, echoing their conversation from days ago. His eyebrows lifted. Terms? Real terms. Equal terms. Not mistress terms, not charity terms. She stepped closer. If I'm in this, if I'm really in this, I'm in it as your partner, not your dependent, not your responsibility. You're equal. He held her gaze. Agreed. And I want it in writing. A slow smile crossed his face. The first real smile she'd seen from him since she arrived. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Turner. I learned from the best. He glanced at the contract she still held. Sign it, he said. Then we'll talk about the rest. She picked up the pen he'd left beside the paper. Her hand didn't shake. She signed her name, Abigail Turner, in clear, steady letters. Then she looked up at him. Now what? He took the paper from her, set it aside, and took her hand. Now we start. Outside, the ranch stirred to life. Cattle lowed in the distance. A horse stamped in the yard. The windmill turned. Inside, two people stood at the beginning of something neither of them could name. Not a rescue. Not a transaction. A choice. Freely made. Together. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the Past. The first bottle shattered against the fence post just before dusk. Abigail heard it from the porch. Glass. A man's slurred curse. Another crash, this one against stone. She did not need to look to know who it was. She'd know that particular stumble in the dark anywhere, the unsteady gait of men who'd spent their inheritance on mash and their futures on foolishness. Jesse stepped out behind her, already sensing the shift in the air. He'd been reading correspondence in the front room, but at the sound he'd risen without a word, moving to stand just behind her shoulder. Two figures staggered through the open ranch gate, hats crooked, clothes stained with years of hard living and harder drinking. A jug swung loose from one hand, sloshing amber liquid with each uneven step. Even from a distance, the sour scent of mash carried on the wind, cutting through the clean evening air like rot through fresh linen. Her brothers, still alive, still rotting, still reaching for her like she owed them something. Tom and Eli were already moving to intercept them, hands resting easy near their belts, but Jesse's hand lifted sharply. Hold, Abigail inhaled once, steadying herself against the wave of memories that threatened to pull her under. I'll handle this. Jesse's jaw tightened. You don't need to. Yes, she said quietly. I do. She descended the porch steps alone. The ranch hands watched. Tom's face was unreadable, but Eli shifted uneasily, as if wanting to intervene. The sky burned orange behind her brothers as they wove across the yard, silhouettes against the dying light. The jug caught the last rays, glinting like something precious instead of what it was, the chain that had bound their family for generations. Well, look at this, the older one called. Caleb. 32 years old and looking 50. Queen of the pasture. Come to receive her subjects. Abby Turner, the younger one jeered. Jacob. 29 and already toothless in spots. Thought you forgot us. Thought that fine house wiped your memory clean. I didn't forget, she said calmly as she stopped several paces away, close enough to see the broken capillaries in their noses, the yellowed eyes, the tremor in their hands. I left. They laughed, the sound rough and humorless. Heard you shacked up in the big house, Caleb sneered, gesturing expansively at the buildings behind her. Callahan's charity case. Must be nice, sleeping in a real bed. Behind her, she felt Jesse's presence like heat from a fire. She didn't turn, but she knew he was there. Knew he was watching. Knew he was ready. He bought you, didn't he? Jacob pressed, stepping closer. Heard it cost him good money. $600 for a used woman. That's more than PA ever got for anything. Abigail's spine went rigid, but her voice stayed level. You're trespassing. Oh, come now. Caleb swung the jug lazily. Family's always welcome. That's what Ma used to say. Family's blood. Family's forever. Ma's dead, Abigail said flatly, and so is whatever family we might have been. Their expressions darkened. The affable menace shifted into something uglier. We could use a little help, Caleb said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Times are lean. Supplies cost more. Law's sniffing around the old place. You're still cooking? She asked flatly. She didn't need to specify what. Moonshine. Rotgut. Liquid poison that had killed their father slow and was killing them faster. Always cooking, he grinned, yellow teeth flashing in the fading light. Daddy's legacy. The word struck harder than she expected. Legacy. She could smell it now, carried on their clothes and skin, the sweet rot of fermenting corn mash, the sour bite of cheap liquor that had soaked their childhood walls. The smell of waiting. The smell of hunger. The smell of men who measured their days in swallows rather than sunrises. Their father had not been cruel in the way Michael had been cruel. He had been worse. Absent while present. A drunk genius with a copper still in the woods behind their shack, always chasing the perfect batch, the big score, the one shipment that would set them all right. He had taught them how to siphon mash before he taught them to read. Abigail remembered carrying water buckets at 10 years old while he slept off a binge in the barn. Remembered men laughing too loud in the yard while she hid inside with her ears covered. Jacob and Caleb already drinking from tin cups they'd stolen from the kitchen. He had called it enterprise, called himself a businessman, called her pretty enough to fetch a fine price someday when the whiskey made him sentimental. Her stomach clenched. We need money, Jacob said bluntly, reeling slightly where he stood. You've got access now. Big house. Rich man. Must be some cash lying around. I don't have anything, she replied. Don't lie. Caleb's voice sharpened. We know you. You always had a way of getting what you wanted. I'm not lying. I have nothing to give you. Caleb's gaze slid past her to Jesse standing on the porch. His eyes narrowed, calculating. Well, he does. The air shifted. Jesse stepped down from the porch slowly, each footfall deliberate. He didn't hurry. Didn't threaten. Just moved toward them with the quiet inevitability of a man who'd faced down bulls and blizzards and knew exactly what he was capable of. I suggest you leave, he said evenly. The brothers stiffened but held their ground. Whiskey courage, Abigail thought. The most fragile kind. You don't scare us, Jacob muttered, but his voice cracked on the last word. I'm not trying to. Abigail did not look back at Jesse. This is my matter, she said. Caleb scoffed. Since when you got matters? Since when you got anything except what men give you? The words should have cut. Once, they would have, but something had shifted in her over these weeks. Something that made her stand straighter and see clearer. Since I decided I wouldn't die in that shack. The words cut clean. They blinked at her as if seeing someone unfamiliar. You ain't better than us, Jacob spat, but there was less certainty in it now. You came from the same dirt. Same blood. Same. No, she agreed quietly. I'm just done. Silence. Wind moved through the pasture grass, bending it in waves like something breathing. A horse stamped in the barn. Somewhere distant, a cow lowed. You're not getting money, she continued. You're not getting grain. You're not getting tools. You're not getting anything from me, except the knowledge that I survived what you're dying from. Caleb's jaw worked. You think that fancy house changed you? No. Her voice was soft but steady. Hardship did. Years of it. Years of learning that family doesn't mean obligation. That blood doesn't mean ownership. That I can choose. For a moment, something flickered in their eyes. Shame, perhaps. Or anger too dull to burn bright anymore. Or maybe just the dim recognition that they'd lost something they never really had. You'll regret this, Jacob muttered. Maybe. She met his gaze. But not today. They turned at last, muttering curses, and staggered back toward the road. The jug swung empty now, having spilled its contents somewhere in the yard. Caleb kicked at a fence post as he passed, but his heart wasn't in it. Jesse watched until they were gone, swallowed by the gathering dark. Then he looked at her. You shouldn't have had to do that. I needed to. You could have let me throw them off the land. Would have taken 30 seconds. And what then? She asked quietly, turning to face him. They'd come back. Or find some other way to claim me, or spread rumors in town that I'd set you on my own kin. This way, she exhaled slowly. This way, they heard it from me. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his gray eyes. You're stronger than you know. I'm learning. She turned to face him fully. I won't be claimed by anyone again, she said. Not by them. Not by Michael. Not even by you, Jesse. If I stay, if we do this, it has to be because I choose it. Every day. The statement hung between them, pride and pain woven tight. He nodded slowly. I wouldn't want it any other way. Town was no kinder. By week's end, the whispers had thickened like storm clouds building on the horizon. They gathered in doorways and spilled from windows, followed Abigail down the boardwalk and through the mercantile like a second shadow. At the mercantile, conversations faltered when Abigail entered. Heads turned. Eyes slid away, then back. The Baron keeps his old flame as hired help. He always did have a weakness for that one. She's back where she started. Funny how that works. Emma Whitaker's voice carried the sweetest edge. Honey over vinegar, sugar over spite. Well, Abigail, Emma trilled one afternoon, smoothing her skirts while 5 children clustered at her knees like particularly demanding chicks. It must be so comforting to return home after all your adventure. Abigail held a bolt of fabric calmly, examining its weave. Blue cotton, sturdy enough for daily wear, soft enough to be comfortable. She'd need new dresses if she was staying. If she was building something. Comfort isn't the word I'd choose, she said without looking up. Emma's smile tightened. She'd been pretty once, in a conventional way. But marriage and motherhood had etched lines around her mouth that constant dissatisfaction deepened. Some of us were fortunate enough to find stability early. She gestured expansively to her children, who were beginning to squabble over a piece of candy. Husbands, families. A place in the community. Dorothy stood just behind her sister, younger and sharper, her gaze drifting often toward the window as if Jesse Callahan might materialize on demand. She wore a dress that was slightly too fine for a Tuesday afternoon, and her hair was arranged with careful attention. I suppose not everyone is meant for that life, Dorothy added lightly, her eyes flicking to Abigail's ringless hands. Abigail finally looked up, meeting Dorothy's gaze directly. No, she agreed. Some of us are meant for more. Emma's color rose faintly. Dorothy's smile faltered. "Well," Emma said briskly, recovering, "Mr. Callahan has always been generous with his resources. I'm sure he's happy to share them." "He has," Abigail replied evenly. "With opportunity. With respect. With partnership." The word landed like a stone. Emma's eyes narrowed. "Partnership?" Abigail set down the fabric. "He's given me work that matters. A voice in decisions. A stake in outcomes." She paused, letting that settle. "I know that might be difficult to understand." The tension hummed. Emma had loved Jesse once. Everyone knew it. She had set her cap for him when they were all young, had arranged to be wherever he was, had simpered and smiled and waited for him to notice. He had barely looked at her. Even after Abigail left at 16, after she had chosen Michael's reckless grin over Jesse's steady gaze, Jesse had not turned toward Emma. He had pined. And then, when enough years had passed, he had married Margaret instead. Someone quiet and suitable, someone who asked nothing he couldn't give. Emma had never forgiven any of them. "Just be careful, Abigail," she said softly, stepping closer. Her voice dropped so the children couldn't hear. "Men don't enjoy being reminded of old mistakes." "And you," she smiled sweetly. "You are a very vivid reminder." Abigail's chest tightened, but she didn't look away. "I'm not the mistake," she replied. She left them standing in their perfumed disapproval, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her. Outside, the street was busy with afternoon traffic, wagons and riders and women with baskets. The sun was warm on her face. The air smelled of dust and horse and baking bread from the hotel kitchen. She walked slowly back toward the ranch, her boots leaving prints in the dust. The whispers would continue. The judgments would persist. Emma would spread her poison, and Dorothy would flutter her lashes at every eligible man who passed, and the town would talk and talk and talk. Let them. She had survived worse than their opinions. Michael arrived 3 days later. Abigail saw him from the ranch road before he saw her, a lone rider approaching from the west, slumped in the saddle, horse half dead beneath him. Even at a distance, she knew the shape of him. The way he sat. The way he moved, her blood went cold. Freedom, she had once thought, looked like Michael Granger. At 16, he had been all grin and danger and movement. He had whispered of open plains and towns without judgment, of nights under stars and days without fences. He had laughed at Jesse's rules and boundaries and measured tone, called him a farmer in cowboy's clothing, a man who'd die of boredom before he died of anything interesting. Jesse had felt like control. Michael had felt like escape. She remembered the day she had rejected Jesse, the way his jaw had tightened when she told him he was too serious, too rigid, too much like everything she was running from. She had wanted wind, not walls. She had wanted to feel alive, not safe. She had mistaken recklessness for liberty. Michael dismounted outside the saloon, swaying slightly. Even from the road she could see how thin he'd become, how hollow. The handsome boy she'd run away with had been eaten alive by the man he'd become. By evening, he was on Callahan land. Jesse met him halfway across the yard, stepping between Michael and the house without apparent effort. His hands hung loose at his sides, but everything about him was alert, ready. Abigail followed at a distance, her heart pounding against her ribs. "You owe me," Michael called out, voice ragged but loud. He was drunk. She could tell from the way he swayed, the way his words slurred at the edges, but there was something else beneath it. Desperation, maybe. Or the last flicker of pride. "I owe you nothing," Jesse replied. "That woman's my wife." Michael gestured wildly toward Abigail. "My wife. You stole her." Abigail's stomach twisted. "You forfeited that claim," Jesse said coldly. "When you put her up for auction, when you tied her to a chair and let men bid on her. When you—" He stopped, jaw working. "When you did everything you did." Michael laughed bitterly. "You think money makes it clean? You bought her like cattle, like a goddamn heifer at market. How's that different from what I did?" The words sliced. Ranch hands shifted uneasily. Tom and Eli had appeared from somewhere, flanking the scene, ready if needed. Michael's gaze found Abigail. "Come on, Abby," he called, his voice shifting suddenly, becoming the voice she remembered from years ago, coaxing, warm, seductive. "Come on. You liked wild better than fences. You told me that yourself. You said he was too stiff, too proper, too." She stepped forward slowly. "I liked being seen," she said quietly. Michael's smile faltered. "What?" "I liked being seen," she repeated. "Not owned, not controlled. Seen. And you," she shook her head. "You never saw me. You saw a prize. A possession. Something to show off and then keep in a corner. You were free with me," he insisted. "No." Her voice was steady. "I was afraid." His face darkened, the charm evaporating like morning mist. You ungrateful. He lunged toward her. Jesse moved faster. His fist connected with Michael's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Michael stumbled back but swung wildly in return, his fist catching Jesse's shoulder rather than his face. They collided hard, boots tearing up dust, grunts and curses filling the evening air. Years of restrained fury fueled Jesse's blows. Michael spat blood and laughter. She'll leave you too, he taunted, even as Jesse's fists drove him back. She hates cages. Hates fences. Hates men who think they can. Jesse's fist split against bone. He knocked Michael to the ground and mounted him, hand closing around his throat. The world narrowed. Abigail saw it in Jesse's eyes, the razor edge between control and annihilation. Saw the years of wanting to do this, of imagining it, of restraining himself, collapsing in a single moment of violent release. Jesse, she said sharply. He didn't hear. Jesse! Her voice cut through. He froze. His knuckles were bloodied, split and raw. Michael wheezed beneath him, face purpling, hands scrabbling weakly at Jesse's arm. Slowly, with visible effort, Jesse released him and stood. His chest heaved. His hands shook. Get off my land, he said, voice low and lethal. Or I won't stop next time. Michael staggered up, hatred blazing in his eyes. He clutched his throat, coughed, spat blood onto the ground. This ain't finished, he rasped. It is, Abigail said. Michael looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, he saw that she was not the girl who had run away with him, not the wide-eyed 16-year-old who thought adventure meant freedom, not the woman he'd beaten and broken and sold. She was something else entirely, something he couldn't touch. He left. Dust swallowed him. That night, Jesse sat at the kitchen table while Abigail pressed a clean cloth to his split knuckles. You could have killed him, she said softly. I wanted to? I know. Silence stretched. You stopped me, he added. Yes. She dipped the cloth into warm water and cleaned the blood carefully, her touch gentle, despite everything. His hands were large. Strong. Steady now, but they trembled slightly under her ministrations. The aftermath of violence working its way out of his system. I thought he was freedom, she whispered suddenly. Jesse's gaze lifted. At 16, she continued, not looking up from her task. You felt like my father. Rules. Expectations. A house that smelled of responsibility and duty and... She paused. And everything I thought I was running from. He said nothing. Michael felt like air. Like space. Like the whole world opening up. And now, she met his eyes. Air can suffocate too. When there's nothing solid to hold on to. When you're just drifting. Falling. She shook her head. He didn't set me free. He just cut the ropes and watched me float away. His jaw tightened. I should have fought harder for you. You were 19, she said gently. You were proud. And I was cruel. You weren't cruel. I was. Her voice cracked slightly. I told you that you were too serious, too rigid, that you'd never understand what I wanted. I made you feel small so I could feel big. He caught her hand, stilling it against his. We were children, were we? He considered that. Young anyway. Young and stupid, and sure we knew everything. She smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd managed since Michael appeared. Yes, her fingers lingered against his hand. I regret it, she confessed quietly. Not because my life would have been easier. God knows it wouldn't have. But because I hurt you, because I threw away something real, for something that was always going to shatter. The admission softened something deep inside him. I was lonely, he said after a moment. Even married. She stilled. I did what was expected, he continued. Built the ranch. Took a wife suitable and kind. Margaret was good, Abby. Truly good. She deserved better than a man who was always looking over his shoulder, always wondering, always. He stopped. Always what? Always looking for you in crowds. Her breath caught. I thought you hated me. I tried to. His voice was rough. God knows I tried, but hating you would have meant forgetting you, and I couldn't, not for a single day. The air thickened between them. Her hand slid from his knuckles to his wrist, feeling his pulse beneath her fingers. Steady now. Strong. His other hand came up slowly, cupping her jaw with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. This kiss was different, not furious like the first time, when years of restraint had snapped. Not hungry in the same way. Slow. Searching. Almost reverent. His lips moved against hers, as if memorizing rather than conquering. As if she were something precious, rather than something claimed. Her hands moved to his shoulders, feeling strength beneath cotton and skin. She pressed into him, and he drew her closer, and for a long moment there was nothing but the warmth of contact and the steady beat of two hearts finding the same rhythm. Years of shame, of pride, of wanting to be chosen for more than beauty or rebellion. of wanting to be seen as herself, not as someone's possession or prize. He stood, lifting her easily. She gasped softly, then relaxed into his arms as he carried her toward the bedroom down the hall. This time there was no transaction in it. No rescue. No debt. Only choice. Later, tangled in sheets and moonlight, she lay with her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath her ear. His arm was around her, warm and solid, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I don't want to be saved," she murmured. "I don't want to save you," he replied. "I want to stand with you." Her fingers tightened slightly against him. "Equal ground," she said. "Equal ground. Partnership." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "In everything." Outside, the ranch lay quiet. The windmill turned. The cattle slept. The world went on, as it always had. But inside, something had shifted. Something new was growing. Her past still haunted her. Her brother's Michael, the years of survival and shame. Jesse's past haunted him too. Margaret's ghost, the years of loneliness, the choices he couldn't undo. But ghosts, she thought, could be acknowledged without being obeyed. The past could be visited without being lived in. For the first time in 10 years, Abigail Turner did not feel like she was running from her history. She felt like she was building something beyond it, with him, together. Chapter 5. Equal ground. For the first time since Abigail had returned, the ranch felt steady, not peaceful. Never that. A place as large as Callahan land did not run on peace. It ran on movement. On decisions. On men waking before dawn and sleeping bone-tired after dark. But it felt aligned. She woke in Jesse's bed without shame. Not hidden. Not kept. Morning light filtered through linen curtains, soft and gold, painting broad stripes across his bare shoulders. He slept on his stomach, one arm flung toward her side of the bed as if, even unconscious, he refused to risk her absence. Abigail lay quietly, watching the slow, rhythmic pull of his muscles as he breathed. She reached out, her fingers barely grazing the heat of his skin, tracing the line of a faded scar near his shoulder blade. He stirred at her touch, a low, gravelly hum vibrating in his chest. Without opening his eyes, he caught her hand, pressing her palm flat against his heart. "Equal ground," she whispered, the words a secret against his skin. "In everything," he murmured back, his voice thick with sleep and a sudden, sharp hunger. He pulled her hand down, guiding it over the hard plane of his stomach, before turning to pull her into the cradle of his hips. The kiss was slow, tasting of morning, and a deep, possessive heat that promised they weren't finished with the bed just yet. But the ranch waited. She eventually slipped from the sheets and dressed before heading downstairs. The kitchen was already alive with sound. Mrs. Klein stirring pots, Tom arguing with Eli about fence posts, the smell of coffee thick and dark. Jesse came in moments later, freshly washed, his shirt unbuttoned at the throat. He walked straight to Abigail, ignoring the men at the table, and placed a heavy, warm hand on the small of her back. The touch was bold, claiming her in the light of day. "This is Abigail Turner," he said to the two new ranch hands. "My business partner." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Tom's brows lifted. Eli's mouth twitched faintly. The new men looked between them, uncertain. "Partner?" one echoed. Jesse's expression did not change, but his hand slid upward, his thumb tracing the sensitive nape of her neck beneath her hair. "She handles contracts and expansion. If she gives instruction, you follow it, same as mine." Abigail felt the weight of the declaration settle across her shoulders. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't conditional. It was public. "Understood?" Jesse asked, his voice dropping an octave, a warning vibration she felt through his touch. A beat. "Yes, sir." Abigail met Jesse's gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, pride, trust, and a raw, underlying current of desire that suggested the business of the day couldn't end soon enough. The sabotage began 3 days later. Tom rode in at noon, breathless. "North fence has been cut." Jesse was on his feet before the sentence ended. "How many head?" "Hard to tell yet. Looks like someone drove a chunk west before dawn." Abigail stood slowly from the table, her mind already clicking through the ledgers. Tracks? Covered, mostly, but not well. Jesse's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively going to the holster at his hip. "Who?" Tom hesitated. "Could be Grady's men. Silas Grady." The name carried weight. Grady owned the neighboring spread west of Callahan land, a man who had clawed his way to the top with sharp deals and sharper threats. He'd tried twice in the last year to undercut Jesse's rail shipments. Failed both times. If he was cutting fences now, it meant he was desperate. Or angry. Jesse grabbed his hat. "Round up a team. We track them." Abigail stepped forward, placing her hand over his on the table. The contrast was stark, her pale skin against his weathered dark knuckles. But her grip was firm. "No." He looked at her sharply, No, not like this, she clarified, her voice a cool balm to his rising temper. If Grady's escalating, charging at him with guns, gives him exactly what he wants. He stole my cattle. Yes, she agreed evenly. And he's hoping you retaliate publicly so he can paint you as volatile. Jesse's nostrils flared. He leaned in close. His scent, leather, wood smoke, and that clean, aggressive male heat, filling her senses. You think I care about paint? I think you care about rail contracts. That stopped him. Grady's been angling for priority loading on the Western Line, she continued. If he can make you look unstable, the rail board might favor him. Tom and Eli exchanged a look. You suggesting we do nothing? Tom asked. I'm suggesting we do something smarter. Jesse studied her, his eyes dark and searching. Talk. We form alliances. Smaller ranchers east of here, the ones you've been supplying breeding stock to. If we secure mutual agreements, shared grazing corridors, shared tracking patrols, it makes it harder for Grady to isolate us. And the rail? I'll go to Kansas City, she said calmly. In person. Secure priority contracts. If the rail gives us guaranteed slots, Grady loses his leverage. Silence filled the kitchen. Tom scratched his jaw. That's a long ride. I've ridden longer. Jesse's eyes held hers, a storm of protective instinct and growing admiration brewing in the depths. You'd go alone? Yes. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He stepped into her space, his body a looming shadow. You're not proving anything by risking yourself, Abigail. I'm not proving, she said quietly, reaching up to straighten his collar, her fingers lingering on the pulse point of his neck. I'm protecting what is ours. He took a sharp breath at the word ours. He reached up, covering her hand with his, crushing her fingers gently against his skin. You think like a general. I think like someone who's had everything taken before. He held her gaze another long moment, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted his hard expression. Then he nodded once. Fine, Tom blinked. You're sending her? Jesse didn't look away from Abigail. I'm sending my partner. The town erupted. When Jesse introduced her publicly at the feed supply meeting 2 days later, the reaction was immediate. Silas Grady stood across the room, thick-bodied and watchful, a smirk carving his face. You brought a woman to negotiate? Grady drawled. I brought my partner, Jesse replied. He stood behind her, his hands resting heavily on her shoulders, a physical shield that felt more like an endorsement than a restraint. My business partner, Jesse added, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Shock flashed openly now. Abigail stepped forward, feeling the heat of Jesse's presence at her back, fueling her resolve. Mr. Callahan and I are forming a cooperative network, she announced. Shared patrols. Shared information. Fair breeding contracts. Grady laughed. And what's in it for us? Stability, she replied. And rail priority access. That silenced him. You don't have rail priority, Grady said carefully. Not yet. The confidence in her tone unsettled him, more than a boast would have. The meeting ended with tentative agreements. Grady's eyes followed her as she exited, but Jesse's arm went around her waist, pulling her flush against his side as they walked to the horses. It was a scandalous display for the 1850s, but Jesse didn't seem to care. He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. You handled them like a queen, Abby. It makes me want to start a fight just so I can watch you end it. The second fence was cut a week later, but this time, patrol riders from 2 neighboring ranches were already on alert. They intercepted the drovers before they crossed county lines. 3 of Grady's men were caught, not by Jesse's gun, but by Abigail's strategy. Jesse watched the captured cattle driven back through his gate and felt something shift. He turned to Abigail, who was standing on the porch. He climbed the steps, his spurs jingling, and didn't stop until he had pinned her back against the house siding. You saw it coming. I've seen men like Grady before, she said, her breath hitching as he leaned his weight into her. Michael. Yes. His hands found her waist, pulling her upward until she was on her tiptoes. I'm glad he's a fool, Jesse rasped, his eyes dropping to her lips. If he hadn't been, he never would have let you go, and I would have had to kill him to get you. The moment was broken by Tom bursting into the yard. Someone's in the lower pasture. Jesse turned, his face hardening instantly. How many? Looks like 2 riders. Trying to push a dozen head out quiet. Abigail's stomach dropped. Michael. She felt it before anyone said his name. I'll go, Jesse said. No. She stepped off the porch. If it's who I think it is, this ends tonight. And it ends with me. Jesse's jaw tightened. You don't owe him anything. I owe myself closure. He hesitated, the conflict plain on his face. Then he nodded once. But I'm riding behind you. In the shadows. If he so much as breathes wrong, I'm ending it. They found Michael near the creek, trying to push cattle through a narrow ravine. He looked worse than before, desperation etched into every line of his face. When he saw Abigail ride up alone, he froze. "You?" he sneered weakly. "Come to beg?" She dismounted slowly, her movements deliberate. "I came to finish it." Jessie remained back in the shadows of the cottonwood trees, a dark, lethal silhouette. Michael's gaze flicked past her, sensing the predator in the trees. "He send you?" "No." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the folded papers. "What's that?" "Our divorce. The legal filing from the territory court." He laughed harshly. "You think paper matters?" "Yes." She stepped closer, into the circle of his scent, stale whiskey and failure. It no longer had power over her. "I won't carry your name in whispers anymore. I won't be the woman you abandoned and tried to sell. You don't get to claim me in any room again." He stared at her. "You think Callahan will marry you? That's not your concern. You always did need a man to anchor you." "No," she said evenly. "I needed to anchor myself. Jesse just happens to be the man strong enough to stand beside me while I do it." He studied her face, something in it, something immovable, made his shoulders sag. "You don't love me," he said quietly. "I don't." The truth hung bare between them. "And you don't love him the way you loved me." She paused, thinking of the way Jesse looked at her in the dark, the way he respected her mind, the way his touch made her feel like a person rather than a possession. "No," she agreed. "I love him better." The words struck Michael like a physical blow. He took the pen she offered. The scratch of ink against paper sounded louder than gunfire. She folded the document carefully. "You'll leave," she said. He nodded once. "I ain't got anything left here." Before he rode off, he looked at her one last time. "You were never weak, Abby. I just had to pretend you were so I could feel tall." Then he was gone. Jesse rode forward once the dust settled. He dismounted and walked to her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of regret. Finding none, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You handled it," he said quietly. "Yes. You didn't need me." She turned in his arms, looping her hands around his neck, feeling the heavy thrum of his heart against her own. "I wanted you there," she said, her voice dropping to a sultry murmur. "That's the difference between a cage and a home, Jesse." He groaned, his hands sliding down to grip her hips, pulling her firmly against the evidence of his desire. "Let's go home, partner." As they rode back toward the ranch, the sun dipping low, Abigail felt something solidify. Not rescue. Not obligation. Partnership. Equal ground. And for the first time since she had been 16 years old, Abigail Turner belonged to no one except herself, and the man who was man enough to let her be free. Chapter 6. The Choosing. Spring came hard and bright to Callahan land. Not gently. Not apologetically. The prairie rolled in emerald waves beneath a sky scrubbed clean by late winter storms. Calves wobbled beside their mothers in the lower pasture, their new life a testament to the season's turn. Fence lines stood straight and mended. The North Ravine, once a jagged weak point, now bore new cedar posts sunk deep and stubborn into the earth. Everything that had once been vulnerable had been reinforced, including the people who lived there. Abigail stood at the edge of the rise overlooking the ranch house, the wind catching the loose tendrils of her hair and whipping them against her cheeks. From this height, she could see almost everything: the sturdy barn roofs, the bustling bunkhouse, and the distant shimmer of cattle moving like inkblots across the swaying grass. When she had first returned, she had felt like a trespasser in her own past. Now, she felt like a cornerstone. Behind her, boots crunched over gravel. The sound was heavy and rhythmic, a sound she knew in her bones. "You're counting again," Jesse said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air between them. She didn't turn immediately, savoring the way his presence warmed her back even before he reached her. 243 head in the south pasture, she murmured. 37 calves born in the last 3 weeks. He stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, following her line of sight. "You don't miss much." "I used to," she said softly, "when I was too busy running to look back." He glanced at her, his eyes dark and speculative. He reached out, his hand sliding around her waist to pull her flush against his side. The heat of him was a constant, grounding force. "You're not running now." "No." The wind pressed her skirt against her legs, but she didn't shiver. She breathed in deep. There was no scent of sour mash here. No rot of illicit whiskey, or the stinging smoke from a hidden still in the woods. There was only the scent of crushed grass, damp earth, and the clean, wild air of a world reborn. She had gone back to the shack 2 days prior. Alone. It had taken her longer than she expected to walk the final stretch of dirt road to the place where she had grown up. The roof sagged worse than before, looking like a weary animal giving up the ghost. One shutter hung loose on a single hinge, clattering a lonely rhythm against the siding. The yard bore the scars of careless living, broken crates, rusted tin, and the remains of a fire pit long gone cold. Her brothers were gone. Neighbors had said they left at dawn 2 mornings before, heading south with what little they owned. No goodbye, no apology. Just a sudden, hollow absence. She had stepped inside the shack anyway. Dust coated everything like a shroud. The old wood table still bore the deep knife marks from her father's careless, drunken carving. The corner where the still once stood was empty now, leaving only a dark, circular stain on the floorboards like a ghost of something poisonous. She had walked slowly through the 2 small rooms, feeling like she was stepping through a museum of her own tragedies. She saw herself at 16 again. 16 and angry. 16, and so desperate for something that felt like a choice, that she had jumped into a different kind of fire. She'd expected to feel rage, or perhaps a crushing grief for the girl she had been. Instead, she felt only distance. That place had shaped her, yes. It had forged her in a furnace of neglect, but it did not own her. She had stepped back outside, struck a match, and tossed it into the dry kindling piled in the hearth. The fire had taken quickly, not wild, not destructive beyond its bounds, but hungry. She had stood and watched until the roof collapsed inward and the smoke thinned into the pale sky. No one had stopped her. No one had mourned it. Some houses were meant to be left behind. Some memories were meant to be ash. "You're smiling," Jesse observed now, his thumb tracing a slow, hypnotic circle against her hip bone through the fabric of her dress. "I burned it down." His brows lifted, a slow realization dawning in his eyes. "The shack? The shack." He exhaled slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He turned her in his arms, his hands sliding down to rest low on her back, pulling her hips into his. Good. They stood together in the silence of the rise. Below them, ranch hands moved with purpose. A wagon rolled toward the barn, its axles creaking. Laughter carried faintly on the wind. It was stability, hard-earned and fiercely guarded. The town meeting was scheduled for that evening. Word had spread quickly that Silas Grady intended to challenge Jesse's rail contract publicly. Rumors of new investors backing Grady had stirred unease among the smaller ranchers. Abigail adjusted the cuffs of her blouse in the bedroom mirror as dusk settled outside. The lamp cast a warm, flickering glow over the room. "You don't have to come," Jesse said from the doorway. He was dressed in his best black coat, looking every bit the ranch baron, but his eyes were fixed solely on her. She met his reflection in the glass. "Yes," she said calmly. "I do." He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He came up behind her, his large hands overlapping hers as she worked the buttons of her sleeves. He leaned down, pressing his face into the curve of her neck, his breathing heavy. "You've already won more than most would dare, Abby." "This isn't about daring," she replied, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "It's about finishing." He turned her around in the small space between the bed and the mirror. He studied her carefully, his hands sliding up to cup her face. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question. She thought of the whispers in the mercantile, the cold stares of the respectable women, and the looming shadow of Silas Grady. "No," she answered honestly. That was the difference. Fear no longer drove her choices. They rode into town side by side, not ahead of one another, not behind. Side by side. The meeting hall buzzed with tension. Farmers packed the benches, their faces lined with worry. Ranchers stood along the walls, arms crossed. Emma Whitaker fanned herself in the front row, Dorothy beside her, both watching the door with sharp, bird-like interest. Silas Grady stood near the podium, broad and smug, looking like a man who had already counted his winnings. "Callahan," he greeted loudly as Jesse entered. "Brought your help again?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Jesse removed his hat slowly, his expression unreadable. "I brought my partner." Abigail stepped forward before Grady could twist the word into something smaller. "Gentlemen," she began evenly, her voice carrying to the back of the hall without strain. "Mr. Grady wishes to question the stability of Callahan rail shipments." Grady smirked, playing to the crowd. "Your ranch expanded fast." "Too fast. Investors like steady men, Jesse, not sentimental ones who let their pasts run the books." Abigail tilted her head slightly, a cold light in her eyes. "Sentimental? You've entangled business with personal matters," Grady said, his voice dropping to a theatrical stage whisper. "Brought scandal into the very heart of your operation." The room shifted. Whispers stirred like dry leaves. "The Baron keeps his old flame." She burned her first marriage to the ground. Emma's lips curved into a faint, satisfied line. Abigail felt the weight of it. Shame, that old familiar blade. But as she looked around the room, she realized the blade was blunt. It no longer had an edge to cut her with. She stepped fully into the center of the room, into the light of the chandeliers. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I returned to the Callahan ranch after a failed marriage. Yes, Mr. Callahan and I had history in our youth. The bluntness of her confession stunned them into a ringing silence. And yes, she continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, we now share both a business and a personal partnership. She didn't look back at Jesse, but she felt him there, a solid, unmoving wall of support at her back. But sentiment does not cut fences. Mr. Grady's men were caught doing that. Sentiment does not steal cattle in the dead of night. His men did. Grady's jaw tightened, his face mottling with a sudden, angry red. You've no proof of such claims. I have 3 signed statements from neighboring ranchers, she replied calmly, reaching into her satchel. Witnesses who saw your riders. Statements already filed with the sheriff. A stir ran through the hall. You see, she went on, the Callahan Ranch is not built on secrecy or intimidation. It's built on cooperation. She turned slightly, gesturing toward several ranchers seated along the wall. They stand with us because they know a fair deal when they see one. One by one, the men nodded, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that spoke volumes. Grady's confidence flickered, his smirk finally faltering. And rail priority? He challenged, his voice cracking slightly. Abigail withdrew the folded documents. Secured last month in Kansas City, signed and sealed by the board of directors. She handed them to the town clerk. The clerk scanned the pages quickly, then looked up at the room. It's valid. Guaranteed slots for the next 3 seasons. A low murmur of approval moved through the hall. Grady's face moved from red to a dark, bruised purple. You think paper makes you powerful? No, she said quietly, her voice echoing in the sudden stillness. People do. And choices do. The room shifted again, but this time, the tide was coming in for her. Jesse watched her with something akin to awe. He didn't need to speak. She had stepped fully into her own authority. Grady looked around and saw what he had miscalculated. The Callahan Ranch was no longer a solitary power he could chip away at. It was a network, a community, and the woman he'd tried to shame stood before him unshaken, her head held high. This ain't over, he muttered, but his eyes were already darting toward the exit. Abigail met his gaze without blinking. It is. He left the hall to the sound of measured, steady applause. It wasn't a wild shout of victory, but something better. It was earned respect. Outside, the air was cool and smelled of impending rain. Emma Whitaker approached hesitantly, her fan closed and tucked into her belt. Well, she said, adjusting her shawl. That was impressive, Abigail. Abigail regarded her calmly. Thank you, Emma. Emma hesitated, then offered a small, tight smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. You always did command a room, even when you were a slip of a girl with dirt on your face. I learned how to stand my ground, Abigail replied gently. Dorothy lingered behind her sister, her eyes flicking toward Jesse with a mix of envy and realization. Jesse, however, barely noticed her. His hand was already on Abigail's waist, pulling her close. Emma studied Abigail one last time. You've changed, truly. Yes. There was no edge in the word. Just the simple truth. Congratulations, Emma said, and for once, it did not sound hollow. They left the sisters behind, standing alone beneath the town's flickering lamplight. You didn't flinch, Jesse said quietly, his voice thick with pride. I used to let whispers decide my worth, she replied, turning in his arms. She reached up, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. I don't anymore. I know exactly what I'm worth. He stepped closer, his body shielding her from the wind. You don't need me to protect you. No, she agreed, a playful light dancing in her eyes. But I like that you would, and I like the way you look when you're ready to fight for me. His mouth curved into a wicked grin. And I like that you don't need it. It makes the having of you feel like a gift rather than a chore. He leaned down, his kiss tasting of victory and a deep, simmering heat. They mounted their horses and rode home beneath a sky freckled with stars. A month later, beneath that same vast sky, they stood before a small gathering at the ranch. There was no elaborate spectacle, no grand parade through town. There were only the people who had chosen to stand with them. Tom cleared his throat awkwardly. Mrs. Klein dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The minister spoke briefly of unions and strength. When Jesse took Abigail's hands, there was no ownership in the gesture. Only recognition. I choose you, he said simply. Not because she needed saving, not because she was a broken thing to be mended, but because she was his equal. I choose you, she answered, her voice steady. When he kissed her, it was not the fevered, desperate clinch of their youth. It was certain. It was a promise. Later that night, standing again on the rise overlooking their land, Abigail leaned into his side. The ranch house windows glowed warm and inviting below. This is ours, he said, his arm tightening around her. Yes, she agreed. It wasn't inherited through blood, and it wasn't stolen through greed. It wasn't built on a foundation of shame. It was built on choice. The past lay quiet at last. For the first time in her life, Abigail Turner felt no urge to run, no need to prove herself to ghosts, and no shadow of regret clawing at her spine. She felt only satisfaction, the deep, steady knowing of a woman who had faced the fire and come out tempered like steel. The prairie stretched wide before them, indifferent and beautiful. And this time, she didn't just stay. She belonged. Thank you so much for following Abigail and Jesse's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of grit, passion, and the 1850s frontier, please don't forget to like, comment your favorite moment, and subscribe for more historical romances and epic adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming.